Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are now live. Welcome to MobLab Live. This is one of our first session of the webinar series of this year, and I welcome you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with some incredible people who are doing some amazing work in civic and political mobilization across the world. And I'll talk about them in a bit. But first of all, I wanted to introduce and briefly just talk about what MobLab Live is. Okay, so sorry again for the pause, but so with MobLab Live, we are trying to find intersection between academics and researchers, basically connecting campaigners, researchers, and academicians together to understand some of the very practical questions that we are facing in the social change work today. And how often have we, while working, have we come across the question around what does social science or the recent research talks about the current challenge that I'm facing right now. And I have with me our moderator, Vanessa Williamson, who is a Brookings Fellow, author of Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes, and co-author of The Tea Party and Remaking of Republican Conservatism. I'm very happy to also welcome our special guest for the session. Hahrie Han is the Anton Wong Professor of Political Science at University of California, and she specializes in the study of civic and political participation, collective action, and organizing. We also have Dave Karpf with us. Dave is an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, and his work focuses on strategic communication practices of political associations in America, with a particular interest in internet-related strategies. We also have with us Meghana Rao from India. Meghana is a senior gender rights campaigner. She has conceived and implemented many award-winning campaigns on women's rights in the South Asian context. So I welcome you all for the first MobLab Live session. I also want to take just 2 minutes of our time to run through how the next approximately 60 minutes will look like for us. Vanessa will help us introduce the topic, generally set the broad context of how we are working on it. Then we will have the discussion with the speakers, some questions, and then we will open the discussion to the audience related questions that you will be posting to us. And then we'll be closing our webinar series. I want to draw your attention to how you can participate or write your questions to us. On your event, YouTube live event page, you must be seeing a chat room which would be towards your right, either top corner, left corner, or right. You can post your questions there. You can also tweet us at MobilisationLab using hashtag MobLabLive. That's all from my end, and I will switch it over to Vanessa for kickstarting the discussion.
Thanks, Aprajita. So yeah, I just want to add my welcome to everyone for joining us today. And the specific question we're going to be talking about is about how social ties scale modern advocacy campaigns. And this, to me, is one of the more critical questions, I think, for anyone who's trying to make political or social change. You know, how do you build and maintain activist engagement? How do you connect people? And in some ways, you know, obviously, I mean, this is an example of how much easier it's gotten to connect people, right? You can reach a lot of people pretty quickly. A lot more people have access to a microphone than they used to. But how do you coalesce all of those voices into actual power to make change? And, you know, I think that, you know, a lot of people have been working on this question. We're very lucky to have 3 experts here to talk about it. In particular, sort of what social connections do, right? Hahrie Han is going to talk a little bit about what social connections mean for organizing. Dave Karpf is going to talk a little bit about how we can use internet tools to get past what some people call slacktivism, right? And Meghana is going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in real life, in the real world. And so I'm really excited to have everyone here. I want to start by talking a little bit with Hahrie. Hahrie Han is frankly, one of the foremost scholars studying how organizing works and does not work. She is the author of several books that I highly recommend as being both rigorous scholarly works and readable by humans. Most specifically, a book called How Organizations Develop Activists. And I should say, as a political scientist by training, my husband is an activist who works on climate change and literally carries the book around to point at the charts for people. So this is a book that I cannot recommend highly enough. So I want to start, Hahrie, by asking you about your recent op-ed in the New York Times, which was on an issue that's about as current as anything could be in this country right now on gun control. There's a real paradox when it comes to gun control politics in the United States, because gun control, it might be hard to believe, is actually popular with most Americans, but it's politically toxic. Politicians won't touch it. And so what we end up having is an ongoing series of mass shootings that happen in schools, that happen at concerts, that kill dozens of Americans, and nothing changes. And so it seems like this crazy paradox that most people would like something to happen politically, and it has absolutely very little chance of happening in the near future. So what's the diagnosis there, and then what's the treatment, Hahrie?
Well, thank you. Let me just start by saying thank you to Aprajita and Vanessa for organizing this and for inviting me to be on it. I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion with Dave and Meghna and all of you. So thank you for that. To your question, Vanessa, I think the problem that you point out around gun violence issues in the United States is one that I began to sort of see when I was a kid growing up in Texas, and saw that, gun violence is one of these issues that was really hard to talk about politically, even though I think the views of ordinary people on the ground are really different. And as I began to sort of study these organizations, I began to see that this is an issue that affects not only sort of gun violence, but lots of issues all over the world. I think to understand that paradox, the first thing to understand is that too often organizations mistake power and resources, right? So resources are a thing that you have. You have more money, you have more activists, you have more supportive public opinion on your side, but that is not the same thing as political power, right? And what we see, I think, on gun violence prevention issues in the United States is that they have a lot of resources, but they don't have power, right? So how do we begin to address that? So one of the things that I've begun to see in some of the research that I've done is that, the resources that organizations like gun violence prevention groups have, what they do is the resources put groups in relationship with power. So if I have more money, if I have more activists, if I have more public opinion on my side, that puts me in conversation, in relationship with people who are decision makers and people who are in positions of power. And the challenge for these groups is, how do you sort of leverage those resources in a way that reshapes the decision-making table and reshapes the decisions that are made so you can make measurable improvements in people's lives. And for groups that are on the side of building people power, I think ultimately that's a question of what is the extent to which you can build a base that can hold these relationships accountable to the views of your constituents, right? And that means having a base that I think has three characteristics. One, it has to be committed. Two, it has to be flexible. And three, it has to be transformative, right? So commitment is the first thing, right? The currency of value in organizing is not money, it's ultimately commitment, right? How much commitment can you generate among your base? The second is the base has to be flexible, right? If we only organize our base around a really narrow set of issues, when that issue changes, right, or when the political circumstance around that changes, the base can't move with you, right? So you need to have a base that is grounded in a broader consciousness about what is the world that we want to create together, right? What is the world that we're trying to co-create all together? And then third, it has to be transformative. If we're only activating people who already agree with us, if we're only just sort of creating containers to sort of channel the activism of people who are already on our side, it's not going to move power in the way that we want. And so I think the challenge in a lot of ways for organizations is how you sort of build organizations that have those three characteristics, or build a base, sorry, that has those three characteristics.
So one of the things that really struck me, and I think it relates both to your point about flexibility and about transformation, is that you say that people who get involved in organizations that actually do have a big political footprint, like grassroots activists that are really getting the job done, often aren't that interested in the issue when they start, which I find so hard to believe.
Yeah, so I first started thinking about this when I read Ziad Munson's book in in the early 2000s, and I should be a publicist for his, he should hire me as a publicist, because I talk about his book like everywhere that I go. So it's a great book called The Making of Pro-Life Activists, and everyone should read it. And he finds that of the people who are on the very front lines of the anti-abortion movement, you know, although half of them were drawn to the movement because they supported anti-abortion issues, right? Half of them were not even sort of pro-life, or they were indifferent to issues of abortion when they joined the movement, right? And that's a really powerful thing when you think about it, because I think very often we underestimate the transformative power of our organizations, right? We underestimate the capacity that we have to sort of transform not only what people believe, like the positions they take on issues, but also their sense of what they must do because of what they believe, right? And I think some of the movements that we've seen historically in the organizations that are the most effective are really able to sort of change people's sense both of what they believe and who they think they are, by leveraging the kind of social ties that we have with each other, right? I'm not going to rethink my views on an issue or my sense of who I am by talking, you know, or it's rare that I will by talking to a stranger. It's more when I'm in conversation with someone that I trust, with whom I feel some empathy, you know, with whom I have a relationship that I can build on to begin to rethink the kind of person that I want to be.
Okay, so this is a question that's partly from one of our audience members, but it's a lot of this seems very labor intensive. You know, this sounds like very hard work that you're asking of people to build those kinds of relationships. Obviously, it seems much quicker and easier to send like an email, right? So Maria from Chicago asks this: how can the research you're presenting on social ties be leveraged to campaign at massive scale when we're looking to engage with thousands of people that have a very small staff team?
Yeah,
I think it's a great question.
It is a great question, and so it is labor intensive. That's definitely true. And if movements were easier to build, we'd see more of them throughout human history that had been more successful, right? So there's no getting around the fact that it's hard to build a successful movement. But that being said, you know, the idea that the only way that we can scale our movements is by hiring more professional staff is a relatively recent phenomenon. Certainly in the United States, right? That this professionalization of movement building is not something that existed prior to the past sort of, you know, maybe 2 generations or something like that. And so the secret to scale, I think, in a lot of ways is, one, are you meeting people where they are, right? Are you sort of beginning to organize them in groups and communities and structures through which people are already engaged? So you're not having to create those from scratch, but you're going to the churches and the schools and the other places where people already gather. And then second, are you building a distributed leadership network so that you're not limited by the size of your paid staff, right? That to me, that's another symptom of sort of mistaking power and resources, that if you're limited by the number of people you can pay, you're only going to get to as big as you can. So the question is, how do you inspire leadership in a group of volunteers who can then sort of leverage their own social ties in the community to begin to do the work? And the, you know, so I think, so it is really hard, right, to sort of, because managing a distributed network like that presents a whole host of management challenges, right? There's a tension between centralization and decentralization. And I think we could have a whole MobLab just about managing, you know, a distributed leadership network, you know, but in every social, you know, a lot of the social movements that we've seen, you know, that's at the core of how they begin to do it. And the last thing I'll say on that point is, I've done a lot of work with a faith-based community organizing network in the United States called PICO, and they do faith-based organizing in low-income communities of color around the U.S. around sort of racial and economic justice issues. And we did a study this past election cycle in 2016 election where we were trying to understand if PICO leaders sort of leverage their social ties within the congregations that they were working in to engage people that they knew in their communities for voter turnout, right? What's the impact of that? And we found that it's really powerful, right? And it had a bigger effect size than all the sort of messaging and other kind of work that studies around messaging and other kinds of things like that we ran in the 2016 election. And so what I learned from that is that when an organization like PICO leverages the power of the sort of social ties that its leaders have in their communities, just from being humans who live in communities, it's able to sort of turn out all these people to vote, you know, which has, you know, follow-on impacts in elections in a way that's much more powerful than what paid staff could do if they were knocking on doors by themselves.
Okay, so I want to push a little harder on this question of resources, though, because I think that I mean, like definitely, I see what you're saying about like, you know, you create a network of volunteers. They'll probably be better than paid staff at the end of the day in terms of like their commitment and engagement. But you know, a lot of communities don't have a lot of resources, both meaning money, but also meaning time, right? So Shannon asks this. She asks about the importance of relationships and transformative organizing. How are those models best used among marginalized communities, given that sometimes they don't have the time to have the kind of training that you're talking about to build these kinds of networks?
Yeah. You know, I have to, so in thinking about that question, so when I first went to grad school, you know, back in the early 2000s, and I thought I wanted to become a political scientist, I was really shocked to begin reading the literature on participation in political science, because it was all oriented around this idea that the thing that's most predictive about whether or not people are going to participate are the resources that they have. And I found that to be really challenging, because for exactly the reason that Shannon points out, that like there are so many marginalized communities that don't have free time, they don't have money, they don't have education or political knowledge or all these other things. And so what are we saying, right? Does that mean that they're not going to get involved? Yet if you look through history, there are all sorts of ways in which those marginalized communities have really organized it and gotten involved. And I think that what I learned over time is that, you know, these marginalized communities may not be rich in resources, but they're really rich in social connections, right? They're really rich in social ties. And the challenge of organizers, I think, in a lot of ways is, how do we turn the resources that our constituents have into political power, right? How do I take the resources of my constituents, however marginalized however marginalized they are, and then turn that into the kind of political influence and things that we are. And I think that's where the transformative work really comes in. You know, I won't sort of speak for Dave, because he has one of my favorite articles, you know, about, or series of articles, I should really say, you know, about the way in which movements sort of take resources among a relatively small group of people and then refract that onto a much bigger scale to be able to turn, you know, the work of a small group of people into something that's much larger than that. And we can see that in the civil rights movement. We can see that in lots of other movements over time. And so I think the real challenge in thinking about marginalized communities is yes, there are many, many ways in which privilege subsidizes movements on the right, right? And it's much more than free time. It's all about sort of all the structural ways in which, you know, seeing a bunch of white people protest is perceived very differently than seeing a bunch of black people protest, right? So privilege subsidizes the movement for sure, but that doesn't mean that our constituencies don't have resources that we can draw on. And the challenge is to figure out how we can strategically leverage them.
That's great. I want to turn now to Meghana, who can bring a little bit of her own experience doing this kind of work. So first of all, I'm just going to throw it open to you, Meghana, to talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing.
I
I'm worried that. Oh, I'm worried that we
really
can't.
Interesting cross connections there.
Hey, unfortunately, I think we have lost Meghana for the moment. Oh dear. Yes, I can see a frozen picture. So I'm gonna give it a minute for our tech gurus to solve the problem. And Dave, surprise, it's your turn. You know, all right. Hey, okay. So quickly, I'm gonna talk for a minute about Dave, and then I'm gonna go to you with this resource question, because Hahrie actually made that connection already. So we're gonna go there first. But first of all, I'll introduce Dave. Quickly, for people who didn't hear the beginning, Dave Karpf is one of the leading scholarly voices on online activism. He has written several books on digital advocacy and organizing, including The Move On Effect and his new book, Analytic Activism. So, oh, please do, yeah, if you have a copy on hand, Dave, I am not opposed to you holding it up at all.
I know it's somewhere. I have piles of books, and one of them is mine.
I left mine in the office, and so I did not hold up anyone's books. But you should definitely check these books out. Dave, I'm going to go to you with a question.
It's a very pretty cover, I swear.
I'm going to go to you with a question about what Hahrie was saying about resources, right? So there's this question, right, that, you know, people who want to make social change often have fewer resources than people who don't, for the obvious reason that the status quo was benefiting that second group, right? So this is a constant problem, and it's not we can't just pretend that this isn't uphill a lot of the time. So what's the sort of online connection with resources and how you sort of deal with that imbalance?
So first, thanks. It's great to be here, and I love talking with Vanessa and with Hahrie in particular, and so it's great to do this in front of people. So one point I'd make about that, this actually comes from my first book, The Move On Effect. The old finding in political science, which Hahrie referenced, I would expand the following way, that those resource advantages lead to a cycle in which those with resources are more likely to get asked, and the single biggest predictor of engagement is being asked. So we get this positive feedback loop where people who have money are the ones who get asked to donate and get involved, and then they donate and get involved more, and then organizations realize, well, we want to engage people, and we got to start somewhere. Let's start with people who are likely to say yes. Oh, look, that happens to be the white, wealthy, well-educated people. So one of the things that we can now do with digital tools is, even though there's still all of these inequalities and many of those reflect and refract digitally, we do now have the opportunity to ask people, because the interaction online is often cheaper than the interaction through other media. When organizations, civil society organizations, had to communicate with people primarily through the mail, that created an impetus to really narrow your lists down to, if you were defenders of wildlife, you really needed to find those people who liked wolves enough to write checks in response to your mailings. Otherwise, you'd go broke writing to everyone. So that really enforced that positive feedback loop where when each marginal communication was costly, organizations needed to triage down to those people who were likely to respond positively, which was usually those with resources. We've seen in the past 15 years the rise of these multi-issue generalist organizations that instead are surfing from issue to issue that is in the public mind and a top public agenda, giving people an opportunity to act because they're acting online. And that means that they can cast a wider net and use that to start conversations. That's not a cure-all. Again, there's still a ton of digital inequalities out there, but that does provide at least an off-ramp for us to engage communities that otherwise we'd be making triage decisions and not going into.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me. I guess I'm like sort of pushing back on it a little bit. I worry that that you can reach a wider net of people, but they don't necessarily have the opportunities for deep engagement. And actually, we've got a question from the audience here that I think is sort of along those lines. This is Eugenia from the Netherlands. She says, in the age of information overload and slacktivism, how can we build relationships in a meaningful way with supporters? How can we connect in a way that goes beyond posting, liking, and sharing? How do we go beyond this space?
Right. So that's exactly it. Once you've established that connection, which you get, if all you're doing is getting people to take an action once, that's probably going to fit the cranky definition of slacktivism, where people are taking feel-good actions and never creating social change. But you can also use that to create a list of potential relationships. And that's where the work of relational organizing really starts off. I come out of the Sierra Club. That's where I was trained in the 1990s as an organizer. I spent most of the early 2000s on the Sierra Club's board of directors and helping to run trainings for Sierra Club, and then kind of slowly meandered into academia as that went on. And in the Sierra Club, that work of figuring out, okay, how can we find people to organize with? How can we find that first layer of people to engage with? That itself was a significant challenge. And then the separate challenge of how can we build an organizational identity and a movement identity, and how can we build power with them? That was a separate challenge. So that second challenge of building deep movement commitment and organizational identity, that itself is still hard to do. And that's where I think we need the type of distributed power that Hahrie was talking about. It's where we need staff who aren't just staff lobbyists, but staff who are supporting, like running trainings and helping people to learn how to run meetings well. That's actually a difficult skill that comes up once you've engaged people once, and then you've invited them to engage with each other more. So I don't want to undercut that. I think that is a hard problem of its own. That's separate from getting people to take a first action. What getting people to take that first action does is gives us a better starting point for that relational organizing. The other thing I would note in response to that question is how we deepen with them is going to depend a lot on what scale we're operating at. If you're doing community organizing within a city, you can use digital in order to find a list of people who care enough about this to take action once, and then you can call them up and invite them to a meeting, or you can send them an email and say, hey, let's all meet. If you're doing that on the global scale, then the way you organize that, the way you scale up that distributed work gets more complicated because now you're operating around a globe instead of around a community. But I think the first thing, since a lot of us are actually trying to create leverage and create power at the local level, I think the answer to the slacktivist problem is, okay, once you get them to take action once,
Okay, so I think we have the unfortunate, we have unfortunately now lost Dave. So we can add to the list of questions, how do we deal with technological limitations when trying to have a global conversation? Okay, I'm gonna take the opportunity to switch back to Meghana, if I can. Meghana, I hope you are with us. I think we may not be able to see her video, but hopefully she can join in terms of audio. I'm just gonna check if that's possible.
Hi, Vanessa, I'm here. Hopefully you can.
Ah, great. Yeah, so you're a glowing orb to me, but that's great. That gives you a level of authority in some way. All right, so I would like to go back to the questions I was planning to ask you at the beginning. First of all, why don't you just start by telling us, grounding us a little bit in the work that you do in your community, sort of transferring off Dave's question there.
Thank you, Vanessa. In fact, I think Hahrie left off at a very interesting note, and I wanted to link with what she was talking about, converting resources of constituents to influence a agenda. A large part of my work in India and in Southeast Asia has been around violence against women, and how do you kind of organize different communities to take action against the pandemic. What initially began as a behavior change communication campaign on domestic violence kind of moved to different geographies in and around Southeast Asia, with versions of that campaign kind of going viral in ages when the digital wasn't even, the D was something that we didn't know. So launching a campaign, bringing on communities of different cultural contexts, but yet having this very strong underlying message of prevention of domestic violence and increasing reporting on domestic violence was something that we kind of together. And the large part of the messaging of that campaign was based on solid, what we would call baseline research around norms of domestic violence and norms which perpetuate violence against women, which would find similarities across the cultural context that we were operating in. And India being such a diverse and interesting kind of melting pot, which has pots of low internet connectivity. So how do we look at mobile and, given that the penetration is extremely high, I think we are next only to China in terms of A, connectivity, and B, how do you leverage tools as mobile to get to women in very, very rural parts in the hinterland, so to speak, in terms of mobilizing them to report violence and things like that. And how do you use these tools to kind of, so more from a tactical approach in community mobilization? And I want to bring in a very interesting aspect of online and offline community mobilization, because those were the really two strong strategies that we needed to adopt to mobilize a large section of the population to say, okay, say no to domestic violence. and eventually how tactical approaches of media and advocacy is very strong using of tools even for online in terms of Facebook and Twitter, and then eventually hosting hangouts like these with police officers and stakeholders and questioning them on why X number of cases have not been dealt with in a particular geographical area. And of course, we had the what can I say, the bandwidth to experiment with a large number of tools as they came out. For example, how do you use Instagram creatively and not threatening online security of women, but yet leverage those communities to enable sharper reporting, access to services, and things like that. So that had been a large part of my work, and like I was saying, adopting these tactical approaches to a Nepal, a Bangladesh, a Sri Lanka, a Vietnam. So that has been a large part of what I've been doing for the last couple of years. And also one interesting contrast that I see, because the organization I've worked for had a US footprint as well. So between these two massive democracies, how do you kind of bridge despite the digital divide, so to speak, right? So how do you marry cultural context, but yet the pandemic of violence against women is still is the overlying macro issue still. However, we're speaking of two different contexts where internet connectivity, like we're experiencing, is patchy. There are urban and rural contexts. So how do you yet bring communities together despite these so-called divides? So experience has been practically on the ground, how to implement and run these campaigns, and especially given that you're also challenging patriarchal notions in every sense of the word, right? From digital access to technology and other platforms for women, with general norms around violence against women. So that has been a large part of what I've had the rich experience and privilege of doing. And back to what Hahrie really said well, I think as a campaigner and as a mobilizer, you really have to put your mind to leveraging what your constituents actually have to be able to influence the larger norm around gender-based violence.
So Meghana, this is really great. You've actually hit on a question that we got live on Twitter about using digital tools in rural communities. And are there some very specific examples of how you got over the digital divide problem in your work?
Yes, actually, that's a great question. When I said it comes at a good time, because a couple of kilometers away from a Delhi or a Mumbai or a Bangalore, essentially you might not have very strong and regular continuous internet connectivity. So that becomes, to a certain extent, a limited tool that you can use. So one of the quick examples that I want to give is when we have hosted like a community hearing of women in Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in northern India, which has very, very high spate of violence against women. So what we did was to organize about 1,000 women in a very small rural community and organize a live kind of interface with the local authorities, the police, the local administrative authorities who are supposed to handle and register cases of domestic violence. So, for example, this kind of a on-ground live event was something that we tried to live stream, and what we actually, one of my colleagues came up with a great idea of using SoundCloud to record sound bites and then relay them back on Twitter. So interestingly, though we could not live tweet the event or do this live, we would do this with a lag of, say, half an hour or an hour post what the women were speaking. And interestingly, there was feedback from Sri Lanka, who was kind of on the same time zone, and Bangladesh, and a couple of other states who were not geographically even in the same domain, to kind of ask us what they could do in their regional context or their immediate geographies. So that was a very interesting example that I could immediately think of in terms of bridging the urban-rural, in fact, even country divide as far as technology and digital was concerned.
That's a really neat thing. So you had this live event where not everyone there had anything like the sort of digital access they'd need to participate online actively as individuals, but you could port that information out and then spread it from another source. That's just tremendous. I wanted to ask you a little more about, specifically about the issue of violence against women and the cultural norms you were talking about. Hahrie mentioned earlier a little bit about the need to, not just reach people who already agree with you on an issue or who are already motivated on an issue, but to reach a broader sort of identity, which is something that in the United States is certainly gun ownership is not just a political issue, it is an identity for people who own guns. And so could you talk a little bit about that in your context in terms of, is there an identity shift that needs to occur? Is there an identity that you need to tap into? How did that sort of resonate with your work?
Well, that's such a great question, Vanessa. And I remember the first campaign we launched on domestic violence, we got massively trolled by the men's rights groups in India by saying that we were out to break the family by encouraging women to report domestic violence. And I remember being caught off guard because honestly, that's not something that I thought would I have to crisis manage, as a campaigner. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right. Engaging with the unconverted, so to speak, is important. But I also think that as campaigners, especially in very tumultuous democracies like India, we have to be very wary of online abuse and online backlash as well, Vanessa, because that's something that women activists face all the time. And I'll be very blatant about it, from rape threats to a massive online trolling. So I agree that we need to talk to unconverted audiences, but how do you kind of engage? That's very tricky because from a picture to a campaign to a comment, anything can be a very loaded discussion. And given that online, and there are more experts here, offers a veil of anonymity, it gives perpetrators that much more freedom to be abusive. So how does one balance that? And I really want to say this, that I think that a lot of the norms that are we see on the street or at work or play out in our homes, online is not very different from that, right? Because it's the same kind of public space, and people choose to act. And those norms really play out in terms of trolling and online abuse, which is really increasing cyber violence day by day, and we don't know how to deal with it. So while you're saying this question, I know in my head, theoretically, yes, we have to speak to the unconverted, get more and more diverse groups into the conversation, unpackage what it means, what violence means, etc. There's this other really flip side that we cannot really distance ourselves from,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really critical point. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about if there were aspects of your campaigns that were about tapping into certain parts of women's identities. Is that something that's sort of a piece of the work that you do, or sort of how do you talk about gender norms and identity in sort of diverse contexts?
I think the aspect of communication and how you use your tools becomes extremely vital here, Vanessa. If you're talking about a mass media campaign versus the kind of event that I described a little earlier, in India, of course, when you're saying identities of women, one of the sharpest identities is the rural and urban divide, right? So how do you encourage a person in Delhi vis-a-vis like the state example that I gave earlier? Across your geographies, you have different communities in the northeast, in the south of India. So, but they are kind of, unfortunately, they are bound together by this one really strong issue, which they all immediately resonate with. Unfortunately, I'm saying that again. So how do you kind of break that first barrier in terms of breaking the silence around issues of violence against women, be it sexual assault or domestic violence, and then move very slowly to the next phase. So the messaging there in terms of your campaigning and advocacy becomes really critical. So if you're using, say, then how do you kind of tweak that messaging vis-a-vis to when you have a more intimate physical space with the women, which I described a little earlier. So I think that to put on that critical tactical hat as campaigners and mobilizers becomes extremely crucial. And also one point before I forget is the context of the language, Vanessa, because there is there are many regional and regional languages spoken in India. So what I would say to you in terms of, okay, Vanessa, stop domestic violence could have a very different regional language connotation, which I have to be very mindful of. So how does that translate across different languages is something that has been is very challenging. So that's another, I think, the bridge the identity and language barrier, so to speak. You know.
Mm-hmm. So actually, I want to stay on this question for a little bit and bring the rest of the panel back in, because we've gotten a lot of questions that are basically on this theme of about how to build bridges across distances, across differences. And I'm just going to read 3 of them here because I think they really speak to one another. The first one is from Pratana in Nepal, who asks, how can we build social ties among unlikely allies to push forward advocacy work, i.e. work through casteism, racism, rural versus urban dynamics, gender dynamics, etc. Tom in the UK says, I'd really like to hear more from Hahrie on how we can deepen engagement on specific campaign issues where the issue relates to a remote area. You're trying to motivate people about something that's not local, not a local issue. And Stuart also asks, sometimes social relationships build big, strong organizations. Other times, those same social relationships seem to make the organizations cliquey with their own internal rules and culture that outsiders don't share and can't or won't penetrate. When organizing through relationships, how can we embrace the former and guard against the latter? Hahrie or Dave, does one of you want to jump in on this question?
I can jump in, but Dave, I don't know if you want to go because you were cut off earlier.
You go first and then I'll follow. And sorry, folks, my computer shut down randomly.
Yeah. So on this question, so the points that Meghana makes about sort of engaging with people and the challenges therein, like I'm completely in agreement with, and I don't mean to minimize that by saying that we need to reach out to people, but I generally think that in any movement, there are sort of people who are staunchly with you, right? And there are people who are staunchly against you. You're not going to convince the people who are staunchly against you, but there's sort of a vast undecided in the middle. And when I talk about sort of engaging people who are in transformative ways, I think what you're trying to reach that sort of vast undecided, people who haven't thought about the issue, people who may have be conflicted about the issue, like people who are sort of open to engagement in a way that the sort of people who are on this sort of staunch opposition to you just aren't. And I think in those situations, like all the research that I've seen is that you're not going to change someone's mind by sort of convincing them cognitively about the sort of importance of a set of policies or something like that. It's about developing a relationship and helping them sort of think about that issue in the context of their own identities and the identity of your broader community. So that's sort of one point that I'd make. The second is on this question of how to build. I think the way we think about building social ties between sort of ordinary people that we're trying to engage is different from how we think about building social ties between organizations or other groups that are sort of part of the movement or either elite actors that we're trying to engage in the conversation with us. And in that way, like I think of coalition building as being, it's about negotiating power, right? And it can be power with as opposed to power over, but it's an exchange of interests and resources, right? So what are the interests and the resources that we have? What are the interests and resources that other people might have? And how do we sort of put those into partnership with each other so that we can both kind of realize the goals and objectives that we have? And so when I work with groups on thinking about the coalitions they want to build and how they want to build those coalitions, we always start with this question of, well, what are you trying to achieve in building coalition or alliances with this other group, right? What are the resources that you bring to the table? Why do you need them, right? And then how do we think about negotiating that essentially? On this question about that Tom raised about sort of how you engage people around issues that are very remote. So, working in developed countries like the United States on global poverty or things that feel sort of very distant to a lot of people. In my mind, that's really the difference between persuasion and consciousness, And so Stuart Hall is a cultural theorist who talks about consciousness as being about helping people re-articulate a vision of themselves in the context of a vision of the future, right? So I'm not just trying to convince you that global poverty matters or that it sucks that there are all these poor people around the world, right? I'm trying to help you think about who is the person that you want to be in this world and what can you do to help create that, right? And that's sort of re-articulating a vision of yourself in the context of the future. And I think that's where these, that's how you begin to sort of link people to issues that might feel very remote, right? It's much more tied around questions of that kind of consciousness. So, and then one last thing I'll just say is I can't actually remember the third question now because I didn't take very good notes, but the note that I had made to myself about it was that one danger that I find, oh, I know what the question was about not getting into these like echo chambers where we're sort of like reinforcing sort of norms and being exclusionary. I think sometimes people use the term relational organizing and they take that to mean leveraging people's existing social relationships to engage people for political action. And that's certainly a part of it, but that's not the end of it, right? And I think that's how you begin to, that's how you sort of avoid that kind of insularity that was described in the question, that, you know, a big part of relational organizing is also creating new relationships, right? And constantly bringing a new flow of people in and out of an organization. One of the very early research projects that I did was with the Sierra Club. That's how I actually first met Dave, is not through academia, but through this work, his work in the Sierra Club. And one of the most interesting things that we found about the Sierra Club is that one of the markers of groups that were most effective were groups that had a mix of people that had strong ties and weak ties, right? People who were really closely knit to each other, but also were loosely connected to lots of other people, and they were all brought into the same organization. And so it's consciously maintaining that diversity that's part of the work of an organizer, I think.
Dave,
So I agree with all that.
Yeah. Go for it.
I would agree with all that. The two additional terms that I would layer in that may be useful are social identity and opportunity structure. So our social identity in terms of working across class and worrying about cliquishness, that what relational organizing helps us to do is develop social identities within movements. And I think of that not only as helping to deepen our awareness of social issues, but also deepen our commitment to it. I come out of the environmental movement, which historically has registered 70 to 80% approval numbers when you ask polling questions. People, when asked the question, tend to say clean air and clean water are nice things. And in the 80s and 90s, when I was coming up, one of the things that we were left with was people would say nice things about that, but they wouldn't do anything about that. The answer to that was organizing, and organizing is hard work, and it's difficult to scale. It has all these challenges. But really what we needed to do there was not only identify the people who already agreed with us, but then also engage with them and build those strong and start with weak ties and then build strong ties so that they view themselves as activists. As a practical matter, the way that interacts with opportunity structures, the opportunity structure is like, what are the leverage points for us to work on this issue? One of the reasons why we tend to see social movements rise within a country when they're in opposition to the government, like here in the United States, we had the Tea Party rising, as Vanessa's written about, as soon as Obama comes into office. Not because there's like new tax policies, but because now there's a thing that they're united against. And we now see the rise of Indivisible and the hashtag resistance in response to Trump. That's not about necessarily people developing radically new social identities immediately. That's about the opportunity structure changing and them seeing a threat. Now, the difference between those things going well and going poorly, I think, is how well we cultivate those relationships and that social identity in the process. So, like, you could have people in response to Trump just clicking dislike or signing petitions. And if that's the only thing that they do, then I think that's going to be a loss, because that quick one-time action doesn't leave much of an imprint. That's not your identity. If it's only a thing that you do for 3 seconds in a day, then that's not a lot of your social identity. The Women's March, just at the start of the Trump administration, that was something that people physically got on buses from New York and came down to DC for, or spent a day in their city walking through the streets with fellow partisans. And all the time that they devote to that then builds a social identity as a person that protests. My wife had never been to a protest before. She spent the day at the Women's March. That then started to ignite a social identity because she was acting with other people. And then you can build on that over time to build that social identity. I think the challenge for these global diffuse issues, I mean, if we look particularly like climate change back in the 1990s, it's not that we didn't know from the science that we had a brewing problem. It's that we hadn't figured out how to create leverage over that for people to take real action. And then in the early 2000s, we started to come up with ideas, things like cities passing ordinances and campus activism, campuses going carbon neutral. That was us forming in the opportunity structure people to engage around this. So they stopped saying, yeah, I'm worried about climate just in response to surveys and started becoming climate activists. Now, there's a lot of artistry in this for us as organizers, both digital and offline. But I think the things we want to be looking at are, first, what's the opportunity structure? What's happening in the world that we can organize around and people will be called to act around? And you can use digital tools in order to identify those opportunities as they're emerging. And then how do we build social identity, which is once we've identified people responding to this opportunity, how do we make it deeper? How do we make it more real? How do we help them to interact with each other?
So I'm going to switch now to, we have so many questions coming in, like my screen is just blowing up over here with great questions, and which is awesome. And thank you guys for participating. That's amazing. So 1 minute answers, guys. That's where we're going with this. So prepare yourselves. All right. So first up from Alice, she says, can you give me some examples you found through field work of organizations or even just organizers who have moved from mobilizing to organizing? Why did they do it and how did they do it? And so I would like to hear some, like a really just a concrete actual case of like Bob the organizer from Hahrie, if I can jump to you for that one.
Sorry, I was on mute. The organizations I've seen that have moved from mobilizing to organizing have done it because they have some sort of, the ones that I've seen that have done it most quickly and most effectively have some sort of external threat that they're facing that they have to respond to. So it's like, and the threats that I've seen have been two situations. One is a problem of scarcity and one is a problem of abundance, right? So the problem of scarcity is like, oh, heck, like we've been doing this for this many years now and we are losing, right? And so we need to do something different. The other is, oh my gosh, like something happened, like the 2008 Obama campaign, all these people are flooding in our doors. We have to figure out how to engage them all. So that's a problem of abundance, which I think is similar to the sort of challenge that a lot of groups in the United States are facing with all the resistance work. So it's like that openness to learning is the first step, I think, in beginning to sort of make that switch. And how did they do it? So I can't answer this in 1 minute, I'm so sorry, but I'll just say that a lot of it has to do with training, right? Creating learning feedback loops within the organization and developing the leadership to be able to sort of develop an organizing program. So it's like learning, training, and then the third thing is rethinking structure, right? Because structure is intimately related to strategy. And so if you're switching your strategy from mobilizing to organizing, you have to figure out how to restructure your work in your organization to be able to do that.
Meghana, I want to turn to you on this too, because we've gotten a couple of versions of this question. But let's say you've got a day one volunteer, someone who came to that one event with 1,000 women. What's the first thing you do to turn that person into a leader in that local community? Or to empower them to continue their work on a deeper level?
I think as mobilizers and creating communities, we need to relate to the influence that volunteer can have, either online or offline. So it is important for, even Dave was saying, to kind of bring people on board with your cause. And what Hahrie also very interestingly pointed out, there's always this a huge sea of undecided people right in the middle. So assuming that is true, and in most of the cases, especially with respect to issues on violence against women, that's usually the case. So how do you kind of make the issue more relatable? A volunteer, this young person, and how does that I would want to repeat this 100 times. How is the personal political, right? How does that connect for the volunteer and young people to be involved in your cause, and more people to kind of join that sea? So that's one, and without taking too much of time, what are the tools that volunteer can take or can leverage to kind of create a circle of influence around them? So it could be or through whatever tool is available, through door-to-door canvassing, to postering. So what are the tools that they can use and which are at my disposal as a campaigner against violence against women? So how do you leverage these two and how do you kind of bring these two approaches together is what immediately comes to mind. So.
All right, another tough question, this from Raphael, and I think it follows very much on what you were saying. How do we make hard work sexy and attractive? Particularly, I think he mentions that, you know, volunteering and activism is often something for young people, right? So how do we make that something people actually want to do? Meghana, if you'd like to take that, you can, or I can toss it to anyone who'd like to jump in on that question. Oh, I think Dave would be willing to take it. Meghana, do you want to have a word first, or?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think the high, Raphael, is to be involved in anything that leads to action for justice and equality, whether that's rights for indigenous people or whether that's rights for women or at the LGBTQI community. So the high there, if I want to put it that way, is to be involved in organizing and mobilizing for rights, correct? The second, I mean, you're right in terms of there is no real reward, so to speak. But look what happened, for example, to quick example of my head, in the US, which made same-sex marriage legal. Now, if you were to measure reward and the kind.
Oh, I'm concerned that we've lost Meghana. I'm going to pop to Dave to jump in, and then we'll maybe bounce back. Dave?
Great. Yeah. So I think there's kind of two routes to making all of that work sexy and attractive. The first, which I think has gotten an influx of popularity recently, is the bold route. It's the route that shares a big vision and tells people up front this is going to be a lot of work. This is what 350.org has done. This is what Becky Bond and Zach Exley talked about with big organizing. That they are going to build a bold vision and say it's going to be a lot of hard work, and that people will sign up for that. Back in my day, to be like a cranky old guy for a second, we usually used a different route, which was the sneaky route. I, from age 16 to age 30, never had a week where I wasn't on at least one conference call for the Sierra Club. If you had told me as a 16-year-old the sheer amount of my life I was going to spend in meetings, I would have fled. And if you had told me halfway through, hey, have you noticed how much time you're spending in meetings, I would have said, yeah, but it's what I do because it's who I am. So through relational organizing, through building an activist identity, I got to a point where I identified myself as one of the people who's fixing this. And even though it meant a lot of meetings, it meant meetings with people who, like me, were trying to fix this together. So by building an activist identity, I then was willing to volunteer to sign up for more and more work as I built more and more skills and more identity. It's a sunny, positive feedback loop. So you can do that sneaky way of building an activist identity and hoping that people don't realize, oh man, this means that I'm going to sign up for 10 or 20 hours a week of grueling activist labor that I could otherwise spend like hiking in a forest. Do the bold route. And you can probably do a little bit of both. But back in my day, we didn't go bold, we went sneaky. These days we talk about bold. I'd say try both, experiment with both, and then actually use data to figure out which one is working better in your issue set.
Wait, Vanessa, can I just say, I just want to say really fast, one of my organizing mentors told me very early on, you can't, as an organizer, you can't think about the cost you are imposing on people, you have to think about the value that you are providing them. And so if you articulate all the work and the asset you're making in context of value and not cost, it reframes the whole question.
That's good.
Oh, that's such a good point. So we're coming towards the end of our time, but I still want to fit in 2 questions, so I'm just going to do it. The first is from Tom in Sydney, and he wants to know whether this sort of relational organizing, the social tie stuff, works when you need to change people's minds, when you're not just getting everyone on board something they already think is a good idea but aren't politicized or active on, but when you're actually supporting something that involves changing the mainstream narrative, changing what people actually think of an issue. Does it work in that context? Meghana, if you're up for it, I'd throw it to you if you think that that's something that fits with your experience, or I could call on someone else. Oh. I'm also not sure that we have Meghana. I do not hear her. All right, does someone else want to jump in on this question? Oh, never mind, we have
I'm
her.
not sure if you can hear me, Vanessa, sorry. Maybe
I can.
go.
Yep.
You can go ahead, please go ahead.
Okay,
Meghana, we can hear you. Go for it.
Meghana, we can hear you. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, Dave, do you want to take a stab at that and I can come later?
No, you go first.
Meghana, it's for you. Go ahead.
Vanessa, can you quickly relay back, because I think I'm losing a little bit of in terms of time lag. Quickly, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So just what's the question is, does building social ties work when you need to change minds?
15 seconds. Yes, it does. It has the tools we have at our disposal can really influence, if not change. I think that's a very big word, and it can also be a very important tactical tool in organizing. If you have to organize for a rally, a protest march, you have tools at your disposal. So yes, at the very basic level of that pyramid, yes, it can build to influence. Whether it can change mindsets, I think that is a long drawn there, and I'm sure there is enough research at our disposal to back that. But as a practitioner, if I can use certain tools to build, like Hahrie was very nice putting it, building networks and collaborations and organizing, I think we have a win right there. That's a big reward for me.
Dave, one thing I'd briefly add, I'd say yes, but it's going to happen very slowly. And the thing you're then going to really need to layer in is thinking clearly about the media environment and the ways that it can reflect and refract your work and amplify it. Because you can build a deep activist identity through that relational organizing amongst the small core that agrees with you. And then in terms of convincing others to challenge their preconceptions, there you're going to need to figure out what's the work we can do that can reach those people in a format that will travel and talk to them where they are. And then you use that to build more ties and organize more. So it's going to happen slowly, and you're going to need media amplification.
I'll just say there's research by Brendan Nyhan, who's a political scientist at Dartmouth College, and he looks at the role, how do you change people's minds when they have deeply entrenched views that are based on misinformation? And I think his research is relevant to this question. So I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to, Aparajita, is it okay if I ask one more question, or are we running out of time? One more? Okay. So this is one that we got from 3 different people from 3 different countries. And they all are sort of similar. Patricia from Spain asks, how can advocacy campaigns help civil society become more resilient under constant disruptive events? Joe from Australia asks about how we can use these techniques when there might be government resistance. And Ian from Thailand asks, how do we build a cross-cultural group from a small base in a military dictatorship, where gatherings of more than 5 are illegal? So at different levels of resistance, I think a lot of people are going to try and answer these questions in a place where there's a lot of pushback, and a lot of it, genuinely dangerous. We can't underestimate that. How do we think about this in that context?
Carefully.
All right, yeah, go on. Yeah.
So first of all, careful. And the things that we want to keep in mind, first is to use communication tools that are as secure as are needed and warranted. If the government is going to be monitoring you, then you should be using Signal and proceeding very carefully. And so you want to keep an eye out for that. And that is, the government is then going to successfully slow down your work by actively hampering you. That's also then going to create opportunities, possibly at the global scale, to create interventions that put pressure on that government due to it. Like if the government is overreaching in a way that then causes a global story, then that can, the old literature on this called this the boomerang model, that can produce pressure globally on that government for its interactions with your group. So you want to be careful, and you want to be thinking about what are the leverage points. If they're being taken away from us, can we find them elsewhere? But I don't want to be glib about this. we have the gift in a lot of countries of the freedom to go engage with civil society organizations and voice protest. And there are a lot of countries where the government is actively intervening. Where it is doing that, you need to move slower and more carefully in response to your opponents and your targets.
Meghana or Hahrie, do you want to jump in? Hahrie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with Dave and would underscore everything that he just said. On the first question that you articulated, Vanessa, about this question of how you build resilience within civil society structures, I actually the final thing that I'll say is that I think Vanessa, who has been very humble about her own work throughout this whole webinar, has actually done some really interesting writing on this question. She has an article in Teen Vogue that I practically carry around in my back pocket that articulates the inherent value of collective organization. And on this question of, and you should also read her books about tax issues and the Tea Party, both of which are very relevant to the whole discussion that we've been having today. But on this particular point, what I will say is that I think one of the things that we have lost all over the world is a sense that there is inherent value in organization and vehicles for sort of creating structures through which people come together. And one of the ways in which you build resilience, I think, is changing that underlying assumption that there is value in that, right? And so there's sort of this like broader cultural work that has to get done, I think, on reinvesting in the collective capacity of ordinary people.
Meghana, would you like to speak on this point?
Just quickly, and I know we're a little bit over time, but the Indian context is a scenario where the right to dissent across is very, very, there's a strong cut down from the current government in terms of freedom of expression of journalists and activists and artists. So when this kind of an environment is existing where your freedom of expression is being squashed, and very deliberately so, using legal tools and court mechanisms, like Dave was saying, the need to be a little more careful, even if that means going a little slow in terms of pushing the agenda, becomes absolutely important. And also, though we have a great portfolio of tools with us, how do we kind of use wisely for it to kind of create maximum impact? I think we're still at that point where, like I said, there are tools that we can leverage. However, given these two scenarios, how do we bring these two together? It's absolutely, and like to connect back to what Hahrie was saying, not to lose the importance of building collectives and not to lose sight of what that power of ordinary people can really do. You know, so belief and also a little bit, what can I call it, tactical smartness to kind of build solidarity networks. I think that is very key to kind of the times, at least we're living in India.
No, thank you. The only thing I'd add from my own experience is that we in the United States, I think, have a lot to learn from other countries about some of these questions that, as they become increasingly relevant, I think, in recent years. But our own history can help as well. There's some great research looking at the civil rights movement and what convinced people in really hard times, facing sort of tremendous physical threats, to stick it out. And one of the most profound sort of findings that you see again and again is that reputation mattered. That is to say, that people were willing to stick out dangerous situations because they were with their friends and didn't want to look bad, right, in a setting where they felt strongly tied to one another. And so I think that even in this context, there's a great deal that this relational kind of organizing has to say, even when the threats are, in fact, so large. I want to thank you guys for sticking it out. I want to thank you guys for being willing to stay a few minutes over because I wanted to answer all the questions. I apologize. I see a whole list of questions in front of me that we did not get to, which I just says we should be doing more. But thank you again. I'm going to pass it back to Aprajita to finish this out.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just quickly take a moment to thank everyone, Dave, Hahrie, and Meghana, for such a delightful conversation. Thank you, Vanessa, for moderating this. On the back end, we had our team members, Ted and Michael, who were sending us questions. So thank you guys for doing that. And thank you, audience, for participating the way, like, never before. I know we didn't get to a lot of questions. So if you have any questions, please do write to us or tweet to us. I quickly want to take a moment to just share Few details around our sessions. That will be the next MobLab live session, which will be happening on 27th of October, which is happening on confronting authoritarianism, understanding and creating resistance. I'm sure there's a direct linkage to how the kind of stuff we talked about today. So stay tuned, follow us on Twitter, and we'll keep sending you updates. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.